All right, I sort of know that the rules may be changing at some point, but I'm going to still ask if people wear their masks just because I'm in that age group of the vulnerable age group. And again, if you look at the expected value, I was talking to somebody, you have to look at the probability of something times its value. And if the probability is really low, that it makes a difference. But if the value turns out to be high, like for me, then the added cost to you is less than the added value to me from doing it. So I just appreciate that. All right. So again, Professor, I sent you an email. Professor Butters has been recording the lectures, and they're usually up in the afternoon. So if for some reason you're sick or you can't make it to class for some reason, then you can go ahead and look at the lecture. Or if you have a situation where you didn't quite understand something, you can always go back and speed through the lecture and get to that part where you didn't understand it. So just want to remind you of that. All right. So last time we were looking at what the supply curve looks like and the determinants of what affects the supply curve. And we said that, price of inputs, if I increase the price of labor, the marginal cost is going to have gone up, and so I'm going to produce less at the same price, right? That's where we're talking about the curve itself. Are you producing more or less at the same price? We said that the technology of production makes a difference, that, if you figure out a way to make computers that's way less expensive, and again, when we look at the Industrial Revolution, when we read How the West Grew Rich and look at the Industrial Revolution, what was that? It was basically a change in technology. We had factories come up, and that changed the technology production and therefore shifted the supply curve out to the right. They're supplying more textiles at the same price than they did before. And then we said in some instances it might be the price of substitutes. If you can use your property, you can use your factory or whatever to produce two different goods. If the price of one of them goes up, you might switch if the cost of switching is relatively low. As I mentioned, farmers that can either grow wheat or corn or whatever may switch depending on what the price of a substitute is, but that's not as often. And then we said the supply curve for the industry is the addition of everybody's supply curve. So the more firms that you allow in the industry, you're going to have shifted that supply curve out to the right. All right. Last little point is the elasticity of supply. And just like we said, there's an elasticity of demand. The elasticity of supply is not something that we pay nearly as much attention to because we know what's going to happen to P times Q along a supply curve, right? If I move up the supply curve, P and Q are both going up, so P times Q is going to go up. If we move down, P times Q is going to go down. So, but just, for completeness sake, the elasticity of supply is the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. Okay? And so it will give you an idea how responsive the supply is to a change in price. But we focus more in this class, we focus more on the elasticity of demand just because we're trying to figure out what's happened at P times Q. So let's, if we just think about if I were to increase the price of labor through the Affordable Care Act, then, because now I have to pay for labor, then obviously what's going to happen is, if I were to draw a picture of what that story is going to be, is that, okay, we're going to shift that supply curve is going to shift this direction. What am I doing here? Right? The Affordable Care Act, a picture of what happened in the Affordable Care Act says, raise the price of an input, going to shift that supply curve to the left. If I do something which lowers the price of labor, which is Senator Cruz, I was just watching him on television today, and they were suggesting eliminating the payroll tax for a couple of months or whatever. So the idea would be, right now, if you're an employer, you have to pay 12.4% of the wages off into the Social Security Trust Fund. Okay? So what I've just done is I've reduced the price of labor. So what's the idea? The idea, by reducing the price of labor, I will not only will move along the demand curve for labor, right? Because the price of labor has gone down, so I'll move along the demand curve for labor, but I will have shifted the supply curve for all goods and services to the right, because I have now lowered the price of an input. All right. That leads us now to the idea of equilibrium. And let me do this here. This is a mug that one of my classes gave me, and it says, 9 million people woke up in New York today and there was exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee, right? And of course, that's because oftentimes I come in and just want people to realize that, right? To see and observe. And of course, that happened again today, right? So why did that happen? It happened because the price system makes it such that it happens, and that's what we're going to look at today. If we look at in the Capitalist Manifesto, if you look at Figure 5.1, it looks at where you put the demand and supply curves together. So why might that be? So if we now put the price and quantity and we put the demand curve for here and the supply curve there, what happens if the price were up there? We'll call that pH. Okay? So for a high price, suppose it's above the point where these two meet. Then what's going to happen is the quantity demanded of whatever the good is, let's say it is toilet paper, okay? If we look at the quantity demanded of toilet paper, it's going to be here, and the quantity supplied of toilet paper is going to be there, right? So what's going to happen is that the quantity supplied is going to be bigger than the quantity demanded, okay? And we'll call this point PE, right? So that if the price is greater than PE, then what's going to happen? Quantity supply is going to be bigger than quantity demanded. What are we not going to see? We're not going to see toilet paper just keep piling up, right? We walk into the Kroger's and there's all this extra toilet paper because the price is set, the price is that high. What's going to happen is the people that produce toilet paper are going to say, hokey smokes, Bullwinkle, we aren't going to be able to sell all that toilet paper, right? If the price is that high, we're not going to be able to sell it all. So what are you going to do? You're going to have a sale on toilet paper, right? We all know that. If what's happening is there's excess supply of something, then we're going to have a sale. We're going to lower the price. And as we lower the price, right, we're going to have a sale. And as we lower the price, what's going to happen? We're going to move along the supply curve, and we're going to move along the demand curve, right? When we change the price, we're not shifting the curves. Okay? When we change the price of the good at the self, we're not shifting the curves, we're moving along the curve. So what will happen is the price will start to fall, and as the price falls, then what's going to happen is quantity supplied goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So this is not an equilibrium situation, right? What is equilibrium? Equilibrium is where there's no incentive to change. If you think back to your physics or something, if there's no incentive to change, then we're at equilibrium. This is clearly not an equilibrium. Okay, there's an incentive to change. We're not going to just keep producing more and more of these goods that we're not going to be able to sell. Now, suppose that instead we have a demand and supply curve, and here's where they intersect, then what's going to happen is if we have we'll call it PL, the price that is low. So now what's going to happen is quantity supplied is going to be here, and quantity demanded is going to be there. So there's going to be all sorts of excess demand for whatever the product is if the price were that amount. Again, that's not an equilibrium situation. You're going to figure out, if you're supplying toilet paper, you're going to figure out, whoa, we got all this excess demand for toilet paper. What should we expect to see happen? We should expect to see the price rise. So in this case, what do we have? Quantity demanded is bigger than quantity supplied. So what ought to happen is price is going to go up. And as price goes up, then what happens? Quantity demanded goes down. Quantity supplied goes up. So we will move this direction if we'll move along the demand curve and along the supply curve. So it's not an equilibrium situation to have the price be below where those two things intersect or the price above where those two things intersect. That is why 9 billion people woke up in New York City and there was exactly the right amount of everything. Okay, why is that? Because the price is going to move if it's not. Now, it may be that in the short run that you're not at equilibrium, right? In the short run, right? In the short run, it's possible that the price is not equal to PE, but then price will change. So in the notice that if you look at Squawk Box this morning talk show and talks about investments and the like, but one of the things they tell you is what's happening to the price of oil, right? And the price of oil changes all over the place, right? And all during the day, the price of oil is moving back and forth. Normally there's a cost to switching your price. So it might be that you got a gasoline station and you're selling gasoline for $1.85 a gallon, and the demand is sufficiently high that you can start raising your price. You might not do it right away. Or if you are handmade, or if you are the Hillsdale Brewing Company and you've got your menu set out, right? Then what would happen is there's some cost to changing your menu all the time, but when you walk in, what they might say, oh, on special today, we have X or whatever, right? So it may be that there are short-run periods where the thing's not quite at equilibrium, but we wouldn't expect that to last over time. So that's why we call this equilibrium. When you're at the point where QS equals QD, where the quantity supplied equals quantity demand, then that's an equilibrium. So in a market economy, what drives it so that why you wake up every day, and it's just an amazing fact that there's about the right amount of stuff every place in America, okay, every retail establishment in America, then why is that happening? It's happening because we're allowing the price system to move back and forth. And if there was a situation where there's a long period of time where you're not at equilibrium, then it's likely something is making it so that the price can't change, right? So if you have a longer term where quantity supplied is not equal to quantity demanded, it's often because there's something that's limiting the price change. And that might be a government, right? Price gouging laws. What a price every state's got price gouging laws which say that, you know what? If something happens to change the demand for a product. So we got a demand and supply. We got a demand and supply of gasoline, okay? And what happens is there's a hurricane that disrupts the oil refineries in the Gulf, and so the what happens is the supply curve shifts to the left. Okay, so we have oil refineries are disrupted. Well, what is that going to do? The supply is going to shift to the left. There's going to be less gasoline out there because the refineries have gotten wiped out. Okay? So what ought to happen is, if we're looking at the price of gasoline, the price of gasoline should have gone up from P1 to P2, right? And the quantity goes from Q1 to Q2. If you have a price gouging law, it says you can't raise the price if there's a natural disaster or whatever, right? You can't raise the price. Well, if I can't raise the price, then what will happen is this will be the quantity supplied here because you fixed the price at whatever it was before, right? That's what price gouging laws do. They basically fix the price at whatever it was before there was a big excess. There's a big increase in demand for something because of some natural disaster, or there's a big destruction. Let's say you have a situation where everybody has to evacuate, right? So everybody's going to the gas station to try to get gasoline for their cars. So in that case, what would happen is the demand curve would have shifted to the right. People who are willing to pay will buy more gasoline at the same price because now they got to evacuate, right? So that should have shifted the demand curve to the right. And if that were to happen, right, if we had a demand and a supply curve here, we start out with equilibrium. And now what happens is the demand curve shifts out to the right because people got to evacuate. Then what we ought to do is see the price go up to P1, Q1. And what would happen is the quantity supplied would move that direction. But if I fix the price here, now what's going to happen? Quantity demanded is going to be out there, but quantity supplied isn't going to go up because I'm fixing the price. So what will we do? We'll create shortages. So what are price gouging laws? What do? They create shortages. Now, that's a matter of what we keep talking about here, seeing and observing, right? You see, why in the world do we pass price gouging laws, right? Because you guys see that the price doesn't go up and you think you're going to be the one that gets the gasoline, right? And so you go, oh, okay, that sounds fair. I don't want those darn gas stations out there exploiting me that, my demand has gone up and now they're exploiting me. But you got to observe that, yeah, you're going to create a shortage. That's what's going to happen. And notice that's when the coronavirus thing first started. There was a big shortage of toilet paper, right? Because what happened? You guys changed your demand, right? You thought, oh my gosh, I better stock up on toilet paper because I don't know if it's going to be available. So y'all run in there, and now what happens is you're buying all this extra toilet paper, right? Because you got there first in line. Yeah.
If price gouging laws fix the price at the regular price, the people who put in these laws must have assumed or trusted the price system to come up with a just price in the first place.
Yes, that may be that, right. Yes, a very good point. He said that price gouging laws must have assumed that people had a just or a fair way of setting prices to start with. And that somehow it's unfair now when there's a big jump, it's unfair to raise the price substantially. And so you're right, there's sort of a conflict in the logic here. From the very beginning. But again, just as we said that a draft is inefficient, right? But you may want to do it anyway, as long as you observe what the inefficiencies are. You might say, well, I'm willing to put up with that to be fair. You might say, hey, I know it's going to create a shortage. I'm good with it anyway. People, whoever, I want to make it so that people who get there first get the gasoline. Okay? And I want to make it so that low-income people, if gasoline's a normal good, low-income people will be able to get it. So, you know, it may be that you want to just, you've observed and you've made that decision. The problem from an economist standpoint is when you don't observe all the costs, when you don't see what's going to happen. Price gouging laws must create shortages. And so, so if you want to put up with a shortage, if you think that that is fair in some sense to not let the price go up or whatever, and you're willing to make that trade-off, that's fine. But realize that it's going to create a shortage. Again, minimum wage, right? Minimum wage is, again, a very similar thing, right? If I have a demand and supply for labor, what's the price of labor? The price of labor is the wage, right? And here's the equilibrium wage. Let's say it's, $8 an hour. We'll just make it $8, okay? And here is the equilibrium quantity that's being hired. So we'll put N. N is the number that are hired. Well, if what I do is I set the price above that and I make it $15 an hour, what's going to happen? The quantity demanded of labor is going to be here, and the quantity supplied of labor is going to be there. Now, recall that I can't pay somebody more than the value of their added product, right? Or I'll go out of business. If you're only adding $12 worth of product, I can't pay you $15, right? I'll go out of business. So the demand for labor is what we would call the value of the marginal product, right? So remember we talked about people make decisions at the margin, right? So the wage, the demand, right? The wage has got to equal the value of the added product or the marginal product. I'll hire one more person as long as the value that I get from hiring them is equal to the marginal cost to me of hiring them, which is the wage. So if what I do is I set a minimum wage of $15, what's going to happen? I'm going to have a quantity supplied of labor bigger than the quantity demanded of labor, and what is that called, right? Unemployment. You're unemployed, you're counted as unemployed in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You're counted as unemployed if you're actively seeking work and you can't find it, okay? So notice what's happening here. One is these people lose their jobs, right? Those folks lose their jobs. That was the amount that was being hired before we raised the minimum wage. In addition, what's going on? People whose opportunity cost is bigger than $8, they're going to enter, right? You're going to enter as long as people are paying you your opportunity cost. And so what will happen is we will get more people looking for work at $15 an hour than we would at $8 an hour. But in addition, I'm going to hire fewer people because the value of their added product is less than the $15. And so we're going to create unemployment. And in fact, Joe Biden's running for president, and he's declared that, right? He said, if I become president, I'm going to try to make sure that we create more unemployment in America, right? And I want to make sure that there are fewer people working in America. In fact, I want to make it against the law for anyone who cannot produce $15 an hour worth of product. I want to make it against the law for them to legally work in America, which is exactly what he has said, right? But how does he say it? I want to have a $15 an hour minimum wage. That's how he says it. But again, it's a matter of seeing and observing, right? It's a matter of if I set the price different than equilibrium, I'm going to either create a shortage of something or I'm going to create a surplus of something. And what's going to happen here is I'm going to create a surplus of labor. There's going to be more labor out there than there is the quantity demanded for labor. Again, rent control, right? I don't know if you ever lived in Ann Arbor, but Ann Arbor has rent control. New York City has rent control. And what is rent control? It says that you can't have your rent higher than a certain amount, okay? So if that happens, again, just as, another example, if I have rent control, what are you going to do? You're going to create a shortage of rental property. Right? Because, I'm just going to, if I have a demand and supply for a rental property, and what happens is, here's the equilibrium price of rental property. If I make the rent control that says, nah, you can't charge more than this amount for rent, which is what the law is, and again in Ann Arbor they have that as well, what will happen? The quantity supplied will be here, and quantity demanded will be here, and there will be a bunch of people looking for rental properties that can't find them. Okay? Notice, how do I reduce the supply of rental properties is I may turn it into owner-occupied housing, right? So instead of renting this stuff out, I owner-occupy it. Notice, this from my law and economics class, talk a little bit about what the different laws are, right? What about Airbnbs, right? Suppose what you do is you have an Airbnb. Are you subject to rent control? So however you structure the law will make a difference. But the bottom line is, what does rent control do? It's going to create a shortage of rental property. There's going to be less rental property than there otherwise would be. So if I make the price too low, I'll not only create a shortage, but there'll always be less of it. But notice also, there'll be less of it if I set the price above equilibrium, right? Setting a price above equilibrium, if I have a demand and supply here, and I make the price, here's PE, if I set the price above equilibrium, you can't force people to buy the stuff, right? So the amount that's actually going to get sold is here, right? So if the price is greater than PE, then what's going to happen is less is going to be purchased than at PE. You can't force people to buy the stuff. If I set the price below equilibrium, if I set the price down here, we'll call it PL, then what's going to happen? Quantity supplied is going to determine it. So there'll be less supplied than there would have been. So you're always going to have less stuff with price controls. Whether you set the price above equilibrium or you set the price below equilibrium, you always have less stuff than if you just let the price go to equilibrium. Another thing is to notice that if you don't do it by price, then there'll be other ways to ration it. If you say, you know what, we're going to set the price below equilibrium because we want low-income people to be able to get it, right? So we got a demand and supply, and we're going to set the price down here. Well, then the quantity supplied is going to be here, quantity demand is going to be here, but you still have to ration it. How are we rationing? We can ration by price. That is, you're willing to pay the $3.25 for the box of Honey Nut Cheerios or whatever at Kroger's, okay? Or if we set the price below equilibrium, then what's going to happen? Then there's going to have to be other ways to do it. That is, your uncle owns the Kroger's, right? And then you go in and, they let you in before Kroger's opens. Or they, just bring the stuff to your house or whatever. So, what will happen will be other mechanisms to ration. So it might be that the owner of the facility I don't know. How many of you ever seen the scene of the soup Nazi? Okay, yeah, right? What is the soup Nazi doing? The soup Nazi is setting the price below equilibrium, right? So people come in and he just goes, no soup for you, right? How can he? Why is he doing that? He set the price below equilibrium, so he's got excess demand for his soup, and that allows him to discriminate on another matter, right? He's choosing to discriminate rather than by price. He's choosing to discriminate by, I forget why he, I can't remember exactly. It was a long time ago I saw that episode, but I can't remember why he's telling some people he doesn't get it. But what that episode, probably if you go on YouTube and you put in soup Nazi, then you'll probably see the scene. And what the scene is about is ECON 105 or ECON 202, right? It's about setting the price. And of course, as an economics professor, when I saw it, that's what came into my head, right? So it wasn't quite as funny, or it was just a little bit different reaction from my perspective than it might have been for somebody else. I'm going, oh, he must be setting the price below equilibrium, right? Probably most people that watched the show didn't think that. Yeah.
Are you talking about a guy who sold soup in Times Square in New York? Is this in New York City, the soup Nazi that you're talking about?
It's a Seinfeld episode, all right? And I forget where it is, but basically he's got a restaurant that sells soup, and he just denies people just because he doesn't like the looks of them. But the only way you could do that, why is he able to do that? He must be setting the price below equilibrium and rationing in a different fashion.
Okay, because I asked because my dad told a story from when he was living in New York City about someone who did this, and
Oh, they actually did it.
Yeah, I think it's a real person, actually.
Yeah, it was based off of a real person in Times Square.
Oh, okay. So there was actually a real person that actually did that, and that's how they got it into the Seinfeld story.
Right.
Okay.
It was just so good that people were willing to put up with it.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's very interesting. See, learn something every day. All right? I'll tell the 11 o'clock class that as well. All right. Just given a couple of examples. Now, again, if you look at the old exams, I have all the old exams from 2010, both the fall and the spring, econ in the Econ 105 folder, in the Wolfram folder, and there's an exam number 1 and exam number 2 folder. If you look back, this is always a 10-point question out of the 50-point exam. There's always 10 multiple choice and 10 true false, and then 4 or 5 essay questions, depending on, but this is always one of them, a 10-point question, where you start out at equilibrium and then something shifts, and then you got to tell me what happens, A, to the price of the good itself, and then I'll have another good, and then you're going to tell me what's going to happen to price and quantity of that good. So what does that tell you? The second good, the first good is either going to be an input into the second good, which is going to shift the supply curve for the second good, or the first good is going to be a substitute or a complement for the other good, because that's going to, when I change the price of a substitute or complement, I'm going to shift the demand curve for the second good. And then I'll say, suppose, and we've talked about this, I'll say, suppose one of these goods, suppose the demand is elastic in the relevant range, or it's inelastic in the relevant range, and then tell me what's going to happen to P times Q. Okay? So again, there's at least 10 fall exams and at least 10 spring exams, so there's at least 20 of these questions to look through. But let's just take a look at some examples. Suppose that what happens is I've got price and quantity for this really good book. It's called A Capitalist Manifesto. And so we're at equilibrium for A Capitalist Manifesto here, and then what happens is Oprah Winfrey says, whoa, book of the week, everybody should get Capitalist Manifesto. So what's going to happen? Your preferences for a Capitalist Manifesto, because you follow Oprah, are going to shift to the right. Right? You're gonna buy more at the same price because now I've increased your preferences for it. Now, what was unfortunate for me is that Rush Limbaugh saw an article that I wrote on a. It was when they had the Occupy Wall Street movement, and so I wrote this article on why these people were. Saying that the market system was really bad, but of course they were all using their cell phones and everything else to organize the thing. So anyway, so he read it, and he came on and he did two segments on this Occupy Wall Street thing that I had written. So this Gary Wolfram, Professor Hills. Unfortunately, my book came out about 6 months after he had done this, right? So it didn't get the increase in demand that it otherwise would have. But nonetheless, suppose that Oprah Winfrey likes my book. So what's going to happen? Well, we're going to start out here, and you're going to say, the price of a Capitalist Manifesto is going to go up because I've shifted the demand curve to the right. People are willing to buy more at the same price, and quantity will have gone up. And of course, we know if price and quantity going up, we're moving along the supply curve. I don't need to talk about the elasticity of demand to talk about what's going to happen to P times Q. But notice that why do you want your movie to win an Academy Award, right? I mean, pre-COVID, when people would go to the movies, right? You'd wanted your movie to win the Academy Award because, there'd be this big increase in the demand for it. And so anything that you can do that will shift people's preferences, you'd like to move it. And again, as I said, you don't see these in movies today, people smoking. Why is that? Because we've done things which have changed your preferences and done what? We've shifted the demand curve to the left, right? If we're looking at cigarettes, if we just sort of think about cigarettes, what happened? Just the opposite happened to cigarettes. So price of cigarettes falls, people buy fewer cigarettes than they did before, okay? Now, again, suppose that, when we talked about the change in the technology of production of computers, if we were now to draw the picture of that, what happened? This is for computers. We changed the technology of production, and so what happened? Supply curve shifted out to the right. Right? I mean, that's if we were to draw the picture of that. So we go from P1, Q1 to P2, Q2. Right? So this change in the technology of production is going to shift that supply curve out to the right. Now we don't know what's going to happen to P times Q. Right? I have to know, is the demand, what's the elasticity of demand? Right? Is it bigger than 1? Is it less than 1? Is it equal to 1? In order to know what's going to happen to the total revenue, total expenditure on computers. Yeah?
Yeah, with regards to the price of an input, is it inevitable that a company will lower prices as the price of inputs decrease? Like, couldn't they just keep the price where it's at and then, keep the excess profits from being able to make the products for cheaper?
That leads us to the idea of, we're going to get to that when we talk about the next chapter on profit. That's a good question. What happens if there's a big increase in demand? Couldn't I just capture it through the higher price, right? And if what happens is, when we get to the next chapter on profit, we're going to notice that other firms are going to enter the industry, right? You are charging $500,000 for a computer, and now the technology of production is such that I can make one for $100. I'm going to start making them for $100 and offer it at a lower price. So when we do the next chapter on profit, what's going to happen is we're going to say profit turns out to be a signal that's going to cause firms to enter the industry when they can make economic profit. And so we'll come up to that next time. That's a good question. All right. So notice also that if you look at the old exams, you can see lots of different stories. But what if we did something where, let's say we make a law about drug use, and we say, okay, we're looking at the demand and supply for cocaine. And we've got a demand curve for cocaine, and we've got a supply curve for cocaine. Right? And so we start out with the equilibrium price and quantity. And so what the government does is the government comes along and makes it against the law to supply cocaine. And the government goes around, and if it finds somebody manufacturing cocaine, it destroys it. Okay? So what happens is the government, it takes legal action to reduce the supply. Now what's going to happen? Well, if what I do is I change the supply curve, so now people, because there's now a cost of supplying it, which I might get arrested, right? So now there's an added cost to that. So what's going to happen is I'm going to shift that supply curve to the left. Okay? So now what's going to happen is supply shifts left. And now what's going to happen is price is going to rise and quantity is going to go down. Okay? So let's say why we were making that law is we wanted people to consume less cocaine. We think it's bad for them, and we want to get people to use less cocaine. Right? So we will have a reduction in the use. But how much will people spend? Depends on the elasticity of demand, right? Suppose the elasticity of demand is less than 1, right? So the percentage change in quantity is less than the percentage change in price. So when price went up and Q went down, what happened? P times Q went up. So people are spending more on cocaine. Right? So then notice what would happen to the market of crystallized methamphetamine. So we look at the meth market. So you had a demand for meth and a supply of meth, and you had an equilibrium price and quantity. Well, if these things are substitutes for one another, then what will I have done? I would raise the price of a substitute, and so the demand shifts right because the price of a substitute went up. And now you're moving along the supply curve, so P times Q went up. So if what you do is you think there's something that people shouldn't be using or it's bad for them to use, but they're going to use it, if you don't make it so they can't use it, right? And you restrict the supply curve, and that demand is inelastic in the relevant range, wherever you are, you're going to get people spending more money on it, and by raising the price of a substitute, you're going to shift the demands for substitutes to the right. Now, you have a vast array of recreational pharmaceuticals today that did not exist when I was at Berkeley in the early 1970s, right? When I was at Berkeley in the early 1970s, if there had been recreational pharmaceuticals, I'd have seen them, right? All that existed was marijuana that had the THC content a little bit above oregano. Okay? Then what did we had? We had the war on drugs, right? And we had the war on drugs, and what do? We started making things illegal and shifting the supply curve to the left. So what did that do? It caused incentives for substitutes to show up. The demand for substitutes increased, and so you ended up with all sorts of recreational pharmaceuticals that exist today that didn't exist then. There's a new book out on the Grateful Dead, anyway, if you read it, one of the things they talk about is LSD used to be legal, and you had the electric acid test. Where people would go to parties, and Ken Kesey would hold these parties, and everybody would drop acid, and all sorts of stuff would happen. Okay, so it used to be legal. Okay, but all that we want to do as an economist is we want to observe what might happen. Now, suppose that I said to you, "Hey, here's what we'd like to do. We'd like to make it so Q goes down and P goes down." Right? So I've got a demand and supply for cocaine, and I want to make it so that P goes down, Q goes down, and P times Q goes down, and the demand for other substitutes goes down. What should I do here? If I'm looking at this graph, here, what should I do if I want P to go down, Q to go down, P times Q go down, and the demand for substitutes to shift to the left? Which curve should I change over here? Yeah. Yeah. Ain't rocket surgery here, right? Let's shift the demand curve to the left. Right? So if I shift demand to the left, then what's going to happen? P goes down, Q goes down, P times Q goes down, and the demand for substitutes goes down because I've lowered the price of a substitute. Right? Yeah.
How do you make the demand go down?
How do we make the demand curve shift? What can I do to shift the demand curve? What do we do for cigarettes? How did we shift the demand curve to the left? Yeah, you change their preferences, right? If I advertise and I change people's preferences, I'm going to shift the demand curve to the left. So what does that tell you? It tells you that if you wanted to have a drug policy that made it so that people didn't use as much of the drug, that people spent less on the drug, and you had something which reduced the demand for substitutes, I want to shift the demand curve to the left. We didn't do that. We focused on shifting the supply curve to the left, right? And again, a matter of seeing, observing, right? Seeing, observing, and of course, can it work? It worked with cigarettes, okay? But for some reason, we shifted the demand for cigarettes to the left, but we didn't when I was at the, I told you I worked for California Division of Forestry for 6 fire seasons, right? And at the fire station, there was a whole bunch of people that chewed tobacco, right? That was at the fire station. You just did that, right? People just chew tobacco. How many have any friends that chew tobacco? Oh, you got a few. Okay, all right. It still exists, but what happened? We changed all these demands, right? We changed the demand curve, and the prices changes, the price of substitutes falling. Again, it's a matter of thinking through and observing. So what I'd like you to do for Friday is move to the chapter on profit, and that's going to that will end our sort of Econ 202 or principles of micro theory. So we understand enough that you can figure out this. What is this law going to do? If I am Senator Cruz's assistant, I should be able to explain. Okay, if you do this, here's what's going to happen, the seeing and observing. So the next chapter we'll work on is profit. Again, look at the old exams. particularly the demand and supply and elasticity question, make sure you've got that down. And if you have any questions, you can bring that up on Friday. All right?